Great. Good afternoon. Welcome to Election Watch. Election Watch here at AEI, as many of you know, and some of you may know directly, is maybe the longest running election program in Washington, going back to 1982. It's been commenting on politics for a long time, and the new version of it for the last couple of years has myself and Chris Starwalt co-hosting and bringing in very important guests who I'll introduce. Couple things to note. We're going to talk here amongst ourselves, but ultimately we will turn to you for questions, both those of you in the room and those of you watching online, either on C-SPAN or on the AEI feed. And you can submit questions to nate.moore, M-O-O-R-E, at aei.org, or with the hashtag, I want to get this right, Election Watch, no, AEI Election Watch, hashtag election, AEI Election Watch. So I'm going to introduce our great panel today. I'll start with Kristen, who's I have in front of me first. Kristen Soltis Anderson is one of the founding partners of Echelon Insights, one of our great polling firms in Washington. You'll see her on CNN. She's been with us before. And she is also the author of a book going back to, it's a 2015 book, which was a book about young voters, about millennials, called The Selfie Vote. And I'll note there's another edition coming out, which is called How I Came to Love My Minivan, the Millennial Vote, which is now in a different place. Okay. All right, so Jeff Horowitz is a partner at Hart Research, and there he is the lead on much polling for NBC, much joint polling with Public Opinion Strategies, and those of you who have come regularly have seen Bill McInturff on these panels. So Jeff is the lead pollster for Hart on that poll, as well as a number of other campaigns. He's here for the first time, and I will note also that Jeff is a great pollster, a very nice guy, but he could throw you a curveball or put a high hard one inside because he has a reputation or a background of being a star pitcher in the Arlington area, going off to pitch at Northwestern, and ultimately being my son's Little League pitching coach at one day in the deep past. So we welcome Jeff. And then Chris Starwalt, who I will throw to shortly, is a senior fellow with us at AEI. You also know him as the politics editor of News Nation. And appropriately on the eve of Halloween, he is wearing his costume. He's a insult comic today. So, But today there will be no mention of Caribbean islands or Arnold Palmer on the panel. So, so I'm going to turn it to Chris to start out.
Well, there's a lot of reasons that you people should like the American Enterprise Institute. We gave you sandwiches, and I think that should be a good foundation for a close relationship for us today. But another reason you should like the American Enterprise Institute is these are real live, a real Republican, a real Democrat. These are two people who are at the top of their game. They're respected, they're esteemed within their parties, they're respected from the other party. And this is one of the few places in America today where real people with real ideas can have real conversations. We're extraordinarily grateful to them for doing it, and we're extraordinarily grateful to you for your support, because it would not be possible without you and these sandwiches. So if you think that you know what is going to happen next week in this election, right? There's probably nothing that I'm going to say to you or anybody here is going to say to you today that's going to dissuade you from your core belief, right? That you know what the answer is. And so we're not going to take any time today to try to change anybody's mind about what's going to happen, because there's nothing left to do, right? It's all been done. It's all been done. What I hope we can do is provide some context so that as we navigate this very difficult space as a country for the next 2 weeks, that you can be informed about it and that you can not be alarmed about it and that you can be a better citizen. So our goal today is better citizenship for us and for you. How's the race? Close. It's close. It looks close. What we don't know is it a close race that the polls are right and it's close, 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 and this is a jump ball? Or is it a race that looks close but isn't? In 2012, we saw a race that looked just as close as this one, right? 1 point, 1 point, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. and the incumbent president won by 4 points nationally and did just fine in the Electoral College. Conversely, in 2016, right, and in 2020, we had races that didn't look close and were close. So you've got 3 scenarios for next week. You've got a scenario in which Donald Trump is again substantially understated in the polls, and he's on his way to the biggest Republican victory since 2004. Maybe wins the national popular vote, certainly is in great shape to take 6 or 7 of the 7 swing states. So that's scenario 1. That's if Donald Trump's understated in the polls. Kamala Harris is understated in the polls. Looks a lot like 2012, right? She gets the last oomph, and she flips those states, maybe 6, maybe 7 of those states. And then there's option 3, which is the polls are right. And we have a 2000 scenario again, and I'll be coming to you live from Wauwatosa, Wisconsin for a week as we count ballots to see who has won this election, if it's really that close. I don't know. If I knew, I wouldn't be here. I'd be playing the futures market, making a mint. But we don't know. And we don't know who got their core voters, who's getting their core voters out and who isn't. And we don't know which way those persuadable voters, high propensity persuadable voters in the suburbs are really going to break. We don't know. So in a very unfair fashion, I'm going to say to the great Kristen Soltis Anderson, I will say, who's right? Which is it? Is this an election that looks like 2000? Is this an election that looks like 2012? Or is this an election that looks like 2016?
So let me lay out the scenarios in a different way. Think of them as a distribution of possible outcomes.
Okay.
If you think of the polls as being pretty much, I mean, I laughed when CNN's poll came out and it was 47-47 nationally, and then New York Times Sienna's poll came out and it was 48-48 nationally. I was like, all right, so they're not really going to give us anything that gives us one hint one way or the other. If you think about it as a distribution, I think of it as like a 60% chance that we wind up saying, okay, that was reasonably close, like a point or two one direction or the other. And then I think there's a 20% chance of the Trump is overperforming again. His polls are missing his voters again, or it breaks late for him or some scenario like that. But I also think there's a 20% chance on the other end that we are seeing polling error more like the direction of 2022, that there are things being captured in the polls like swings toward Trump among young voters and Latino voters that are being captured in polls that may not materialize. And in that case, Harris winds up winning by more than expectations. All of which is to say, I think there's about a 60% chance that the polls are pretty right, but that's only slightly better than a coin flip, which isn't very satisfying. And I can say this as someone in the industry. We are trying our very hardest to get it right. Even if you don't believe in our altruism, or even if you don't believe in our academic and intellectual integrity, believe in nothing else than our financial incentives. You want to be the pollster who was right. It is very good business to be the pollster who is right. So lots of people, I think, complain. They say, oh, pollsters are putting their thumb on the scale because they want to manufacture one outcome or the other. We really want to be right. But sometimes in our industry, it's easy to fight the last battle. This is why the polls were wrong in the last election. Let's fix it. But it's hard to know what's going to be wrong the next time around. And that's why I reserve that 40% for those outside outcomes where the polls are quote unquote wrong.
So she's not going to tell you. There you go.
Sorry.
There you have it. She's not going to tell you. Okay, you, sir, your poll, highly esteemed, highly scrutinized. Mm-hmm. And the argument for movement toward Donald Trump and the race moving in his favor, your poll has been a core data point that points to the direction of Trump closing strong, right? Is that how you see your results?
No, and let me back up first.
Yeah.
It's great to be here, and these are, as you said, these dialogues where we have everybody coming together and talking about things in a very rational and thoughtful way is super important. It doesn't happen very much anymore. My firm, Hart Research, this is a fun fact. I think this is probably true, is the only place where both esteemed fellow scholar Michael Barone from AEI and Kamala Harris worked.
Yeah, true. He's got that.
And so
That's right.
think about that, and think about that if that would be possible today. for someone from Michael Barone's background and Kamala Harris' background to work at the same political polling firm. So what this election, to me, we can look at past history sort of as prologue. The 2020 election never ended. And that is very important. We saw very clear, January 6th happened. And the vice president was at the ellipse last night for a reason. That election never happened, that never ended. And so what we're struggling with here is, and pollsters what keeps us up at night, is turnout and who was going to vote. We had a super close election last time. And the question is, are both sides able to get out their core groups? There has been some realignment in some places, which is important. And the poll, the NBC News poll that you mentioned, had a 5-point advantage for Harris in September, and now to even. And what that fundamentally was I think in September, that was post-debate, post-convention, where she was being introduced to people for the first time. And I think there was some sort of movement toward her at that time, but it really then snapped back to where the race had always been, which is an incredibly close election. And I'll add to that, I was talking with a reporter a couple of nights ago, and I gave a response very similar to what Kristen said. He said, well, we don't know anything. And that part is not true. And this is the part where polls get misused about, we want certainty, right? We want to know who's going to win and who's going to lose. And what we're both telling you is, we don't know that, but we know a lot about what is going on in this election. We know a lot about the issues that matter, whether it's inflation, abortion, reproductive freedom, democracy, immigration. All of those are at play, and they're turning out voters in different ways. And we know that this is an election about change, which is...
KSA says it's 60% likely that the polls are right, and this is a very close race. Mm-hmm. Is that about where you are?
Yeah, but so the point on change is really important, because that's what this election is about, and this is what Vice President Harris was really trying to close with last night, I think in an effective way, is who can bring change and who's more effective in that. And in our last poll, there were more concerns about her by 2 points than Donald Trump, and I think that's what she's working against at the very end. There's also a 16% in the middle that are super important. But yes, we are in the middle here. We are doing everything we can to get this right, and as Kristen said, it's in our interest to do so.
He's not going to tell you either. So there you go.
And maybe I could follow up just because the point that perhaps there's some good signals for momentum or movement for Donald Trump, but you've also been doing House polling, and I think other people have been looking at the House, and some people have some sense that there might be some better news for Democrats. What do you have to say about what you're seeing in the House races?
Well, the House races are, again, there's this very thin Republican margin right here, and in these races, we are seeing the Democratic candidate overperform the top of the ticket, which is not a normal circumstance. And what's remarkable about the last couple of election cycles is that there's been so much more money spent on House races, where in the past you kind of had to ride the coattails of the top of the ticket and hope for the best. These candidates now have the resources to be able to tell their own story and have their own brand. And I think you're seeing that in a lot of these races where they are, and this would be super interesting on election day, is that actually going to happen, or is it going to revert to the top of the ticket? And so there are a number of races here, particularly in Pennsylvania. I think we'll talk a lot about Pennsylvania over the course of our conversation, but those races are super interesting. And then on the margins, there are places like Nebraska too, on one side, where that's sort of trending Democratic, and how that is going to play out, versus a Maine too, where that's a Republican district. And so if you see someone, an incumbent Don Bacon in Nebraska against Tony Vargas, is he going to be able to hold on there in a place that's shifting, versus in Maine, Jared Golden, is he going to be able to hold on to a pretty red Trump district in a presidential election year?
Great. So I'm going to jump in and say a few things. And we typically, and those of you in the room will have a handout. So we definitely want to talk a little bit about the Senate and House races and the governor's race. I think there's really only one governor's race of interest. Jeff already started with the House race. But let me just say a few things. We've all talked about the race is close. I think that's right. That there's been some movement, and it depends on how much you judge, how big a movement, or whether it's still going, probably to Trump and the Republican side at the presidential level, and maybe in some of the Senate races. That some of the traditional measures that you might look at, like the president's job approval rating, is probably something that might be good for Trump and Republicans. And whether this is all true or not, the Trump campaign seems to be more optimistic, going to places that maybe they will be proved wrong. They shouldn't be going to Virginia and Minnesota and Albuquerque and places that the sort of next tier states, which really are probably a pretty good ways out of the 7 states, but they certainly have been doing that. So it's certainly there to watch. Another thing to think about is these 7 states that we're talking about, they were already tightly compressed in the last election. The most Democratic state was about 2.8% for Biden, and the most Republican state was North Carolina, which is about 1.2%. That's 4%. I would say in the polling, we tend to see them grouped in like 2 to 2.5 points away. So really thinking about even ranking states, there's probably a way of ranking states which are more Republican, more Democratic, but that's a lot harder when they're that close together. And if the race moves a little this way or a little that way, it's not hard to see all those 7 states moving just because they're right there, and where the final results come in could be really on the right or the left of that 7. Another question, and maybe I'll ask that of the panel, but I'll throw it out there. There's some people who wonder whether the Electoral College for Republicans, the Electoral College advantage for Republicans is as large this time. Nate Cohn of the New York Times made a case that might be smaller. We'll have to see. Typically, the last couple elections, 2.5 to 3.5 points or so, you'd say Democrats might need to win by that much to get the states over the line that they need to win in the Electoral College. Perhaps it's a smaller number this time. Again, I'm interested in watching that. The early vote. People are reading the early vote tea leaves. My simple point on this, having looked at this for many, many years, is I'm extremely cautious about reading much into it at all. I mean, the simplest point is, of course, you could get your voters out early, and then there's nobody left to show up on election day. I will say Republicans are a little bullish on this because they seem to be doing more of it. Donald Trump's comments against certainly mail voting and even early voting generally seem to not be taken up by the campaigns who are pushing their voters to go early. And if you are to read anything, I think the place you can read them is in states that register by party, which is some of our 7 states, 4 of them, but also waiting till more comes in. So Nevada, people are watching. Nevada's going to have a lot of early vote. It looks pretty good for Republicans, but still, if you start looking at Nevada by the weekend, I think maybe you have enough in that you start to see a pattern. But I would be very cautious, even though, again, Republicans are a little excited about this. Then finally, Senate. Let's just quickly talk the Senate. I mean, I think everybody understands that West Virginia is a seat that will go to Republicans. That would make it 50-50. Montana is a state that Republicans have a very good chance to do well. Ohio, I think, is a state that people are arguing about. A state that Ohio has become a much more Republican state in the presidential elections. Sherrod Brown is a strong incumbent. The polls are relatively close, but I would certainly watch that as the most next likely to potentially flip. And then I think there's some interesting questions with the 3 blue wall Senate seats. All of them, 2 of them held by incumbents, and 1 of them is an open seat, but all of them had shown some Democratic. The Democrats were looking better than the top of the ticket, Democratic Senate candidates. Those seem to have narrowed a bit. I think the polls still show narrow leads for Democratic candidates, but many of those Democratic candidates, in fact, all 3 of them are running ads to some extent with Trump in them about fracking or about immigration, and not totally hugging the Kamala Harris campaign, and that might be a sign that Republicans are pointing to that things are going well. Arizona and Nevada obviously seem like a much less likely, although I will note that those states, especially Arizona, might be good states for Trump, and I think the candidates there might have a hard time closing that up, but I wouldn't be surprised to see it compress a little more towards the partisan makeup of those states. Democrats are talking about a few states. Nebraska, it's an interesting race. I actually don't think ultimately Nebraska will probably go in the Democratic column. Dan Osborne, who is an independent running with a kind of a Democratic flavor, but running as an independent, is doing pretty well with a lot of polls he's released. In some ways, it might remind you of not the same state, but not far away, Kansas a few years ago with an independent Greg Orman, similar name, who looked like he was doing well, and you just wonder whether the partisan composition of the state, which will be very Republican ultimately, will hurt him. But of interest to Democrats, and Texas and Florida also, although the ability to put lots of money or as much money as you might need to in those states, certainly at the presidential level, might make them more difficult. And again, I think both of those states don't look too bad for Donald Trump. I'm going to go too long if I do all this. So we've talked a little bit about the House. I mean, I guess I'm interested in the panel's thoughts about whether the House might be different. I think Jeff made the case that the House, people are spending more money. I mean, the House is obviously very close in many ways, but maybe there'll be a slight tilt towards Republicans at the national level, but the localism of, especially in New York and California, and places where we might not know the outcome, especially in California right away, might make some of those races more competitive. So I will leave it there. I do think I would like to talk to the panel about a number of things, and a couple of things I haven't talked about are who will count quickly, what's going to happen on election night, but we'll save that for future conversations.
Let's talk about turnout first. Let's talk about what we're swimming in. So 2020 was the highest turnout presidential election of the modern era, post universal participation, right? And 2016 was one of the lowest, right? 2016 was basically almost a midterm sized kind of turnout. We look at these early vote numbers that come in, and I think those numbers are big. And then I think, well, compared to what? Because in 2016, about 40% of the country voted early and absentee. And then in 2020, because of the pandemic, about 60% of the country voted early and absentee, a 50% increase in early and absentee voting. So starting with you, Kristen, but I want you both to weigh in on this. What do we know about what turnout is going to be like? And are we expecting an electorate closer in size to 2016 or closer in size to 2020?
So the smart folks at my team at Echelon Insights, we have put together a projection that is disturbingly, I don't want to say precise because we don't know how precise it really is, but I mean, we go down to precincts and we project out demographically what we think turnout's going to look like in terms of college education level and race and all of that. And we are projecting about 153 million votes, which is down a little bit, still pretty high. But also the population has grown a little bit, so it's both down in terms of raw numbers and then down a little bit more if you look at it in terms of percentage of eligible voters turning out. So we think it will still be high, but not as high as 2020.
Okay, what do you see?
Yeah, I think it definitely feels like it will be lower than 2020, and this is one of these weird situations where historically Democrats have felt like a higher turnout election has usually benefited Democrats. But the core of Trump's support are infrequent voters or voters who, again, you wonder why he's doing the Joe Rogan podcast, but he is trying to reach out voters not only who maybe only voted in 2020 for the first time, but haven't voted before. And that is historically a very difficult proposition. What's also true is that Donald Trump has been very good at turning out those voters. And so it does feel like certainly lower than 2020. I think 2020 was just because of COVID, but it was a unique election, one that I don't think we won't see again for many reasons, hopefully. But I think that, I think turnout is going to be maybe closer to 16 than 20.
I did not expect that we would see the emphasis on young vote, that between these two candidates, that we would see such an emphasis, Kristen, on young voters, and that the Republicans would be so focused on younger voters, right? This is a reflection of a realignment that's going on in the parties. Talk about how you see young voters' participation levels and partisanship.
So you're right, there has been a real shift in terms of the Republican posture toward young voters. Back when I wrote the book about millennials, back when millennials were young voters, Republicans were doing terribly with millennials and really weren't paying them a lot of attention. The assumption was, they'll get older and they'll become conservative. They don't really vote that much anyways. We don't need to focus on it. Donald Trump, while doing many things that were not what I advised in my book Republicans should do, has nevertheless made it more of a priority to reach younger voters. And in particular, young men who were very disaffected with both parties. You would particularly see among young men a more sort of isolationist foreign policy worldview that they felt wasn't being represented in the two parties. And so that issue was one where there really was this ripe opportunity for a candidate to come in and say, hey, I'm different from what you've heard from other politicians. And so in that way, you have seen Republicans doing better, at least among young men, less so among young women, because the Dobbs decision has played a major role in creating this generation gender gap.
I want your counterpart to talk about that. So we've got, 8 states where there are abortion referenda on the ballot. How do you see this as a motivator? How do you think this affects the electorate?
It's huge. It fundamentally changed the election in 2022, and I believe it's going to do the same thing in 2024. And it matters to a lot of people, not just core Democrats, but voters who are in the middle, and more women than men. But it's a huge issue, and that is, I think, a real focus. And one of the things I have a great deal of skepticism about early voting, and I think it's all we have. So people focus on it, and I understand why. But it matters on who counted what that day and who went home early from voting. There's so many variables here. But the one thing that is true that we know is that there's a gender gap here in early voting, and that more women are voting early than men. And given the polling and the gender gap that we're seeing in all of our polling data, is that does benefit Democrats generally. And particularly when you talk about the younger voters being there's a huge gap here with young men and young women, which we haven't seen before.
What would you say the argument some make that this was an especially good issue, abortion, in the midterm election, because Democrats are now much more the party of college-educated people. College-educated people turn out in big ways. This was a very motivating election for them. But then in a bigger pool, that maybe it's diluted a little bit more, that it's not as strong an issue. Do you think that's true, or do you see it really breaking through even in presidential?
It is, and if you see a lot of the ads that are out, the closing arguments are about freedom. There's also an important conversation about understanding the economic pain that people are feeling and making real changes there that people are going to feel right away. But the reproductive freedom argument is really, really important, and it resonates in a way that many other issues don't. And I was going to say, and think about the number of states where there are ballot measures. It is literally on the ballot, not just in terms of who you vote for different offices.
Someone like Donald Trump, the reason why he was a little bit reluctant to come out in favor, opposed to the proposed ballot amendment in Florida, is he is banking on there being a lot of folks that vote for Donald Trump at the top of the ticket, and then further down the ballot, vote to amend the state's constitution to enshrine Roe. And so he knows that that the Republican Party has to win by winning over some voters who are not pro-life.
So to talk about some other demographic issues, people are talking, Trump campaign is talking that they're going to do better among black voters, maybe especially young men, but better among Hispanic voters. I think also, we're not ignoring it, but we don't hear as much about sort of the two even bigger groups, white non-college voters and white college voters. Where do you see all of these going relative to the past? Are these trends going to continue? What's your crystal ball on the underlying demographics?
So I'll again give you an unsatisfying answer, which is we'll see next week. But I wrote a column today at the New York Times that says this election could be a realignment or it could be a reboot. And what that means is it could be a realignment, meaning that all of these changes under the surface that we're seeing, Republicans doing better with Latino voters, Republicans doing a little bit better among black men, Republicans doing a lot better among young men. Meanwhile, Democrats running up the score with college-educated white voters, et cetera. That election, that we've supercharged this realignment that's been brewing for a while, and it gets cemented in. This is our new reality. But there is also a chance that you get a reboot. And I think if you looked in the crosstabs of the CBS YouGov national poll from last week, you see this playing out, which was, I think in that poll, they had Harris and Trump basically splitting the white college-educated vote, but they showed Harris running up the numbers with young voters, running up the numbers with Latino voters. They showed Trump running up the numbers with seniors. And so it was a much more conventional sort of, the Obama coalition gets reassembled, we're rerunning 2012 all over again, just with new characters. That's why I called it the reboot. And so it depends. Both the CBS poll and the New York Times Siena polls had the same top line number, effectively. They said it's a toss-up. But under the surface, one says it's happening because of a realignment, the other says it's happening because of this reboot.
Go ahead.
And I totally agree with Kristen. I think the two groups that I'm going to be really focused on are white college-educated women and Latino men. Both the margins by which they're voting and also the turnout. That's the real question. And historically, white college-educated women really vote. They are super voters. And so they make up a larger share of the electorate. And if those margins in the polls, in a lot of the polls that we're seeing hold, that is a really, that tells us one thing. And if the Latino men keep shifting away, that tells us another story.
So what about you people? What about pollsters? So the polling error in 2020 was more substantial than it was in 2016. It got less attention because the expected outcome occurred. Joe Biden was expected to win the presidency. He won by less than he was expected to. Whereas in 2016, the polls were more accurate than they were in 2020, but the unexpected thing happened, which is Donald Trump nicked her by 75,000 votes or whatever, by turning the key in the lock of the Electoral College in those northern blue wall states. There was enormous effort put into, we're going to fix polling for 2020. And then there was a pandemic, and everybody stayed home, and polling got super weird. And the error was it. What do you say to the theory, and I'd like to hear from both of you on this, what do you say to the theory that pollsters have succeeded? This is a Nate Cohn joint. What do you say to the theory that pollsters had corrected for the problems in 2016 of not controlling for the white working class's low response rates and those other things, and that the polls are going to be better this time? What do you say?
I think there's a 60% chance that he's right.
She's too tough. She's too tough.
Look,
you don't get a sandwich.
Let me give a brief defense of the polling industry, which is that of all of the surveys that are done out there, an unbelievably small fraction of them are political surveys. People will say, I've never taken a poll. You may not have ever taken a political poll, but the odds are that you in some way have given your opinion to a corporation regarding a brand or something like that. The political polling industry in some ways nowadays is built off of infrastructure that is supporting corporate market research departments that are doing an unbelievably higher amount of research. But the thing is, if you're doing polling for Coca-Cola and you're trying to figure out what percentage of Americans like Coca-Cola today, and I come back and I say 70% of Americans like Coca-Cola, but the real answer is 60%. No one's ever really going to know that. You will never be held accountable for being 10 points off.
And it's good enough.
It's good enough.
Yep.
But in what we do, if I put out a poll that says Trump is ahead by 2 and Harris wins by 2, it's like people come at you with pitchforks. And so, to the political pollsters out there, like, we are the one small piece of this industry that really does face this brutal level of accountability every 4 years. And there's also the problem of what we do is, I think, somewhat misunderstood by the public or misused, misconsumed by the public.
It's your fault.
No, it's not your fault. You all in this room, because you're trying to be informed consumers of this. But if I put out a poll that says Trump up by 1 and Harris wins by 1, I, as a pollster, will be celebrating. Hey, we got it pretty darn close. Polls are not built to be precise down to the tenths of a point. If you see a poll that puts out its results, by the way, with a decimal place, like, I always look very skeptically at that anyways. An analogy I've been using is if any of you bake as a hobby, it's really good to weigh your ingredients instead of just like scooping them out. You want to make sure you have exactly the right amount of flour, etc. But you wouldn't use your bathroom scale to measure the ingredients for a cake you're making.
That's gross.
Well, in addition to it being gross, it would also just be, it's not precise enough. It's built to do a different thing.
Right.
And I think polls are built to help give strategic advice, paint a picture for what's going on and what a campaign might need to do to change that future. We're telling you what the future might be so that you can change that future. And yet people, I think, expect them to do something with a level of precision that they simply are not built to do, even if they are done perfectly. And then this all elides the question of, have we fixed what was wrong? And I will.
Very nice of her.
First, will Coke beat Pepsi? That's the question. Will Coke beat Pepsi?
I'm pro Pepsi. I understand. This is one of my minority views. Yes.
What on earth is the matter with you? I'm rethinking all the esteem and respect that I had for your professional work, knowing that you drink Pepsi over Coke.
Right.
That's just wrong.
So I like the baking, and I guess I won't eat any of your baked goods.
Yeah.
That's okay.
I'm not using my bathroom scale. That's the point.
But no, I actually think about this as a jury. So we are surveying a jury of 12, except for political polls, we don't know who's actually in the jury.
Right.
So we can tell you, hey, these 12 people think he's guilty. Oh, but there were 7 other people over there who were actually in the jury, and those 5 weren't. And so that's the one, like, we are measured on something that is unknowable. We don't know what the electorate is going to look like until election day happens. These are not registered voters. These are people who are actually going to vote. So there is that challenge. And I think Kristen's answer was great. The other thing I will say is for our political clients, we're not polling right now.
Right.
We're done. Because our job for our political clients is to tell them the contours of the election, exactly as Kristen said. How do we convince voters to vote for our candidate? What are the most effective messages? What do we have to think about? And they're going. So the public polls you're seeing now, they're super interesting and they're important, but they're not actionable. And that's the difference between what we do for our political clients and what you're seeing there at the end of the day. And it's one question versus in a lot of these polls, I would encourage you to look at everything else in the poll.
Yeah.
And that tells you a lot more about what's going on here when you see the 48-48 result in someone's last poll versus, well, the trend lines here on Harris's rating, she's up a couple points, Trump's down a couple. On the internals on who's going to bring change, that Trump's up 2, he was down 2 before. Those are more meaningful than 48-48, with the understanding that everybody wants certainty. And again, 60% out, and then we don't know.
Is it more that people who vote Republican, people who in 2016 and 2020, is it more that people who were typically going to vote Republican were harder to poll, or was it that Republicans were harder to poll, right? Was it a demographic response rate problem, or was it a partisan response rate problem?
So there are a lot of good theories on both sides of this conversation. My feeling, and there could be a 2/3, 1/3 thing going on here. My feeling is if you look at the core of Trump's base, these are people who are infrequent voters, who are super distrustful of institutions, and don't like to tell people what they think on a phone call if it's a stranger. So these people are precisely the people who are harder to get on a phone to take a poll. And so I think whether we could get the quote right number of Republicans, but if we don't get the right number of super Trump core base Republicans in our polls, and this is what we're working to do to correct for that, that makes it harder.
And there's one thing that some pollsters, my own firm included, are trying to do this year, but it is admittedly a little bit of a experimental cure type situation, is waiting to past recalled vote. This is controversial in the industry, and even as somebody whose firm does it, I will acknowledge that it is imperfect. We basically are just asking people, who did you vote for in 2020? And then of the people that we know on the voter file actually did vote in 2020, we weight our sample accordingly to make sure we are not oversampling Biden voters or oversampling 2020 Trump voters, to make sure we do have enough of those 2020 Trump voters included. The problem with that, there are a number of potential problems with that. One is that, again, it is assuming an electorate that is an educated guess about what turnout will be, and therefore it holds your numbers a little more stable rather than letting them float a little more freely as public opinion may ebb and flow. And so you're holding your data more stable, but potentially more artificially stable in doing so.
And this goes to his point about the missing jurors, which is that your sample is right if your sample is right.
And so this is something that for the NBC poll, it's something that we do as well. We also look at this across geography. So one of the issues was in rural areas, a lot of the polling in 2020 undercounted Trump's support. And so what we really pay attention to was not only just the overall, but what did the vote look like in urban areas versus rural areas, and making sure that that comes close in our polling to what was the actual result. Kristen's point about historically being careful about waiting to recall vote is important because people forget.
Yeah.
Or they don't like to admit that they voted for the losing candidate.
Brian Williams effect.
But this goes to my point about the 2020 election never ended. We feel a lot more comfortable waiting back to this because people very much remember who they voted for.
Yeah.
And that's a key difference from prior years where it's like, did I vote for Kerry? Did I vote for Boyo? That was 3 years ago. This is different.
And you've both gotten into some of the reasons, maybe some of the Trump voters, especially presidential elections, are harder to get to. But obviously the big one people had talked about was just educational level. Is that enough? Or I know pollsters are trying to wait to education. Is that enough? Are there ways of doing it? Are pollsters doing that well? Or is it just kind of covering part of the problem?
It's one of the first. So I wish more pollsters released all, like when you see the top line data, I wish more pollsters released all of their questions, all of their demographics. Two of the questions I look to first, I look at party ID, I look at recalled 2020 vote, and I look at education. And if education is not close to where it should be, and it's because it's also true, again, this is the part of the problem with reaching those core Trump voters, they tend to be non-college, more non-college than not. And so if you underrepresent people who have a high school degree or less, that is going to have an impact. It's going to boost up the Democratic number in a way that is not real.
Okay, so national polling in 2020 was actually pretty good. It was all right. 2022 was a very good year, relatively speaking, for polling. But state polling, this is my cynical self, I have low expectations for the accuracy of state polling this time around. Is that, am I rightly cynical about how good state polling is liable to be?
Sure, and some of that is, for many pollsters, myself included, we like to rely on the voter file as our sort of ground truth.
Explain what that is.
The voter file is the publicly, I say semi-publicly available list of everybody who's registered to vote in a state, and it also includes, depending on what your state you're in, different pieces of information. Some it will include what party you are registered with, if that's a thing your state does. But they will also include what is your vote history, not for whom you voted, because we have secret ballot, but are you somebody who votes in primaries? Yeah. Do you vote in every presidential election? Do you vote in every midterm? Those sorts of things. And so we can know, okay, this person is 95% likely to turn out because they vote in every election for assistant dog catcher. Whereas this person barely ever votes, so we give them a 50% likelihood of turning out in a big presidential year. And so the voter file varies in quality from state to state, but you have to use it, I think, as your ground truth.
And past voting is the greatest predictor of future voting.
Right. It's not perfect, because if you do have a surge of new voters, that would make it somewhat harder to detect it. But what worries me about 2020 is that in 2016, when the polls were off, the diagnosis was that we were, as an industry, not counting education important enough, and we needed to have more of these non-college educated voters. And then by 2020, pollsters had by and large fixed that. And yet things were off, but they were off in a sort of patchy way. You would have a state like Arizona where the polls were actually pretty good. And then Texas, which is not demographically identical, but it's not completely different. Texas, you had people before the election being like, maybe Texas will go blue. Texas did not go blue. And then you had similar patterns play out in other places around the country. I think it was in Georgia, the polls were okay.
Yep.
But in Florida, the polls were way off. And so the problem after 2020 was the industry, they did a big report, what went wrong? And the conclusion was like, maybe it was COVID? And because there wasn't a clear answer to why were the polls off in this state but not this state, and that state but not that state, that to me is why some of the state polling stuff still makes me a little nervous.
You agree?
Yeah, no, I do, and I think it is also the nature. It's hard. It is to do a poll well. It costs more money than to do a poll not well.
Yeah, let me just interject here. For everybody who's clicking on the El Cheapo polls that flood the universe at this time every 2 years, good polling is very expensive. These are nice suits that these people are wearing up here. They did not take the metro here. Actually, you may have taken the metro here. You're both very virtuous people.
They don't bake in their bathrooms.
They don't bake in their bathrooms. The low quality, the amount of garbage polling that floods the space of El Cheapo polling that's out there. Good polling, the kind that these people do, is very expensive because you have to hire operators who do it well, who are impartial. You need voter files. You need all of this work. So just saying, listen to these people, don't click. Go ahead, I'm sorry I interrupted.
No, I would just say, if you care about a specific state, I would find a poll that is based in that state and look at their last couple of polls close to the election. And that will tell you, it may not be perfect, but it may tell you something rather than, again, insert name of 3 words that where
exactly.
It has polling in it.
Yeah.
That you've never heard of before.
Yeah.
Can I come back to the question? I raised it in my remarks about whether possibly the electoral college advantage for Republicans is shrinking or will be different than it was in the last couple of elections. Some question of why you might be polling nationally now, or what it gets you, but still, national polls and state polls would probably show that maybe things are a little closer. What do you have? What are your thoughts about that? And of course, there's the universe of big states and other states that we don't poll a whole lot, so that's part of the equation.
So no, I think in some of you are seeing the state and the national polls looking closer than they did in 2020 at this stage, by and large. And this does go to some of the, on the margin, some of the places where Trump may end up doing better than he did in 2020. This is with Latino men, for example, and with black men perhaps, and in places that electorally may not matter, a place like California or New York for him. And so there is a chance that could happen. where again Biden won by 4 points, and it was much closer on these battleground states. So I think there's a chance that could play out.
You buy that, Kristen?
I do. I also think, remember that voters in battleground states are just experiencing a different election than voters who aren't. If you live in one of those 7 states, I am so sorry for what you are going through right now. I'm sure turning on the TV to watch anything is deeply unpleasant. I wrote a column about this a few weeks ago, that there was a point in time where the national polls were looking a bit more favorable toward Harris than the battleground state polls. And my theory at that time was that if you are a voter who lives in Denver, you are not turning on the TV and seeing ads about Kamala Harris, positive but more negative, constantly. But if you live in Phoenix, if you live in Philadelphia, you are. And so there just was a different information flow to voters in the battleground states that was making it more of sort of an even fight than it was in non-battleground places, when there was a little bit of that post-convention high that has since faded away, which is why now I think the gap might be a little smaller.
But what about the idea that we've alluded to here about Donald Trump is in New Mexico, he's in Virginia, he was very famously in Madison Square Garden, in California, that the Democrats' advantage in the national popular vote is less because there are more Trump voters in these blue states. What about that?
Yeah, I think there is some credibility to that. I mean, I still think that if I was the Harris campaign, I would want to be up by at least a field goal in the national polls, for sure. But Donald Trump, again, he just has his own coalition that is not transferable. It's unique to him. For all that someone like me spent a long time criticizing him as the ostensible leader of the Republican Party, he is outrunning down ballot Republicans in an awful lot of places. He has a unique coalition that may be specific to him and not transferable to other Republicans.
And we are going to get to your question soon, and I will shut up soon, but I do want to ask you about my hobby horse. And my hobby horse is that Donald Trump is now a typical Republican, which is to say this way. The Republican Party, there he is right there calling. The Republican Party is different because of Donald Trump. Donald Trump is different because of the Republican Party. He's changed it more than it's changed him. But he behaved, in the polls at least, much more like a typical Republican. He came in, he quickly consolidated support in his party, and we didn't get the thing that we got in 2020 and very much in 2016. So let's talk about time of decision. In 2016, there was a big chunk of undecided. And what we found out in the end was that those folks, that when that glacier of undecided votes melted, 80% of it ran off to Trump, right? Whereas this time, those folks have been with him from the beginning. The Republican Party has been much more united this time than before. Is my hobby horse the correct hobby horse?
I think there are like 3 horses there, so I'm
pick the one where I'm the most right. I want you to pick the one where I'm the most right.
So I accept the premise that the Republican Party is his party now. I think that's indisputable, because I think independents are now that's where Republicans so no, I accept that part, and I think the voters who are sort of in the middle now, the undecideds, are really more undecided, and I think in some ways they're actually more leaning toward Democrats in the past. That's because it is younger, it is more Black voters, Latino voters. These are folks who, and again, it's small numbers, but were more likely they voted for Biden in 2020, not because they particularly liked Biden, but because they were voting against Trump. And that's what's sort of hanging out here, and that's why what Harris was doing last night, sort of the close, and dealing with this idea of who's bringing change, because these are people who are really dissatisfied, is so important. So I think it is the people who are hanging out and not sure right now are not who they were in 2016.
Yes?
I think of the undecideds as the overthinkers and the underthinkers.
Okay.
The overthinkers are the people who they really don't like Donald Trump, but they really don't like Kamala Harris. And they're trying to figure out how do they justify like one of these decisions.
Yeah, and they probably know who they're not going to vote for.
They probably know who they're not going to vote for, but they're just trying to decide, like, do I bother with this at all? And that may explain some of this pivot at the end on the part of Harris toward the democracy argument. Like, I'm not going to win you over on the idea that you like me on policy, but what if Donald Trump does another January 6th? Don't put your name on this. And that's kind of targeted to the mythical Nikki Haley Republican, who I get asked about all the time.
Who kept getting 20% in the primaries.
But then there's the underthinkers, which one of my focus group respondents last week, I did a focus group of Michigan voters, and he said, I have some friends who like barely pay attention to this, and they're considering maybe voting, and it feels like they're like a cat with a laser pointer, that they're just like, they're all over the place. Like whatever they just saw in the news that day, they're like, oh my gosh, can you believe Donald Trump did this? Oh my gosh, can you believe Kamala Harris did this? And so, but that kind of voter, they're still unlikely to turn out unless something captures them and the laser pointer's in the right spot at the right time and they cast a ballot.
And, and that was the 2016 from the Access Hollywood tape to the Comey.
Those are your glaciers.
Yeah, okay, got it.
So if nothing else, you'll have a lot of images in your head coming out of this
panel. Bathroom cakes.
I do think one more round of questions, and then we're going to turn to you. So again, be ready with your questions. The one thing we haven't really talked about, and I think it's fair in a way, I think we've all talked about it being close and the 7 states are close, but we haven't really talked about the 7 states. So maybe you could give a little rundown on where you think they are. Maybe states that you think would be more likely to be towards Trump, whether he wins or loses, and more likely to Harris, and maybe a couple states you'd say those are the ones right in the middle. So what's your sense of the weighing of the states from left to right?
Yeah, well, I think I'm going to focus on the blue wall states because I think they were super important in 2016. I think that's, I think people, you kind of forget a little bit that, yes, these were the states that Biden won in 2020. Harris doesn't necessarily have to win all of those states again to win the presidency. And so I think those were states where Clinton came up short and Biden won. And I really do think those are the 3. I think Michigan and Wisconsin are a little bit different demographically than Pennsylvania, but I think all 3 of those states are super, super important. And Pennsylvania in particular, just because it has so many, not only does Pennsylvania have the presidential and the Senate race, which Michigan and Wisconsin do as well, but there are also 3 really interesting House races in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania 7, Pennsylvania 8, Pennsylvania 10, and they're different. And so I think that's a state where I'm just going to be really focused on election night and probably the day or two. And you'll have to tell us how many days we'll have to wait for that. But on the days after, because I think that will tell us a lot about what's going on in the election.
I'm really interested in Georgia because I thought Georgia had such an interesting pattern last time around. If you looked, I think it was the New York Times did a map of like how much each county swung for or against Trump relative to where it had been in 2016. And you see this big blue donut around Atlanta where the suburbs of Atlanta had swung in a pretty leftward direction. They were a big part of delivering that state to Democrats. I wonder, is the blue donut holding? Is it the case that these suburban voters who last time around were the types of folks telling pollsters like me, I don't like Donald Trump, I can't stand it anymore, are they now the voters who are telling pollsters like me, you know what, actually it wasn't so bad under Trump? Do you suddenly get a red donut this time around? And the other thing that I think is interesting is in a place like Atlanta, for all that there was that blue donut, very inner city Atlanta actually swung a little bit red. That was the beginning of this like, is Donald Trump actually improving among black voters, Latino voters? And so Georgia's one state where you can keep an eye on that kind of a trend.
But if I had to push you and say, there are 1 or 2 states you think Trump will do the best, 1 or 2 states that Harris will do the best, which would they be?
So as much as I have said we should not be looking at the early vote, that is, Jonah Goldberg always calls me a hair-specs, which is, I think means like somebody who literally like reads entrails to determine the future.
More images for you here.
The early vote in Nevada, there's your entrails. I have nothing if not evocative. And that's a state where Republicans are looking at this early vote data coming in. And with all of the like warning labels and disclaimers, it's one where they're saying, oh, this actually looks pretty good. And it's the kind of place that has so many working class, Latino, et cetera, exactly the type of voter that if a realignment's happening, Nevada is a place where Donald Trump may do reasonably well.
It should, if they behave, the states run from Michigan and Nevada as the most Democratic of the 7 to North Carolina and Georgia as the most Republican. Are we likely to see them get out of order? Because that puts Wisconsin and Pennsylvania as the tipping point states, right? One way or the other. Do you think they are going to get out of order?
Sure.
You think Trump could win Nevada and lose Georgia?
I think a wide range of outcomes are on the table.
All right, and
She's
actually,
good.
Chris,
She's good.
I wanted to ask you too. You're asking good questions, but how about yourself? What's the best state or best state or two for Harris? And what's the
I
best
think
state or two
I
for
think what we're going to do in the future is we're going to save America a lot of money, and we're going to save Americans a lot of time, and we're just going to let Pennsylvania choose the presidency. It'll be my apologies to my sister who lives in the Pittsburgh suburbs. You're going to get even more direct mail, but look, I think I agree with your premise, which is essentially there's no map for Kamala Harris that doesn't have Pennsylvania in it. There just isn't. I can't conjure one. There isn't a world that I can imagine in which Kamala Harris wins Arizona and loses Pennsylvania. And in 2020, we had to wait 4 or 5 days to have it be done. But come on, was Joe Biden going to win Arizona and lose Pennsylvania? No, because Pennsylvania is more Democratic than Arizona. The states have a nature unto themselves, but they have a nature in relation to each other, right? And is the tipping point state Wisconsin, which was, of the blue wall states, the weakest one for Joe Biden, right? He only won it by 0.6 of a point. It was the closest. Then we go down the other side, North Carolina. Donald Trump only won that by 75,000 votes, about half a point. As we fill up the bucket, where does it fall? And we come back to, as we get to the end of us talking and get to you talking, which is, here's your 3 scenarios. Polls are wrong, and Harris is understated more than Trump. Polls are wrong, and Trump is more understated than Harris is. Or number 3, the polls are right, and we're going to be counting for 2 weeks, right? The polls are right, and we're going to be in Waukesha, we're going to be in suburban Pennsylvania, because if the race is really, really that close, we're likely talking about Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. That's likely what we're talking about. And I would just say this as a PSA, the people who are in this room and the people who are watching on television and the people who are watching online and all of that stuff, you are the custodians of the Republic for the next 2 weeks. Because the people where you live and the people where you work and the people who you talk to look to you for counsel and guidance and advice. And you have an important job to play, which is to calm them down. People are going to get extremely worked up. They are going to get extremely bothered. And your job as a good citizen for the next 2 weeks is say, this is the process, this is how it works, this is what happens next. And we've had, fortunately, a massive stress test of our Constitution for the past decade, and everybody knows how it works now, and you all know how it works now. And I would just encourage you, in my do-gooder mode here, I would just encourage you to be a voice for normalcy, for stability, for courage and confidence, and belief in the constitutional order for the next couple of weeks, because it could get extremely weird out there. So please be emissaries of normalcy in your space.
Go ahead.
So I totally second that. Also, it's a great reminder about how we vote is different.
Yeah.
And early vote versus in person, even though Republicans, I think it's a good thing that more Republicans are voting early just for everybody. It's an important thing to do.
Yeah, we want to count it.
But things are counted differently, and so that's also really important to keep in mind. The other thing, which I want to save your sister in Pennsylvania, it's actually much simpler than this. So since 1980, heading into the 2020 election, there were 19 counties that had predicted the winning candidate in a presidential election. 18 of them got it wrong in 2020. There's one left, which is Column County, Washington. This is a John McCormick piece in 2020. So we should cede the election to Column County. It's the farthest northwest you can get in the U.S. And we should
get 54-40 or fight.
And we should let them vote. But the bad news is you can talk to, they take their time.
Yes, and that was my last comment, and a little bit of a plug is, of course, if it's very, very close, things are going to take a long time in any state, and we could go to the extreme example of Florida in 2000, where, of course, 500 votes, we'll be here forever, and I'm not going to say anything about that. But a couple things on what we might expect in terms of how quickly we see some results. One, a plug. I have a podcast, The Voting Booth, which I do with the EAC Commissioner Don Palmer, a little more on election administration, how they run. You can look at some of our old episodes, but we're going to be live on Election Day talking to state secretaries of state, local election officials, getting a sense from them of what's coming in and what the process is ahead. So look for us. But I think my take on this is a little different than some of the common wisdom. I do think the states like North Carolina and Georgia will be generally very quick. Again, if it's razor thin, it'll take a while. But they will report fairly early. They don't have lots and lots of mail votes. Lots of things are good in that way. I actually think Wisconsin and Michigan, Wisconsin people sometimes point to as taking longer. I think Wisconsin will be relatively quick. Michigan will be relatively quick. Even Pennsylvania. I think Pennsylvania people are all worried about Pennsylvania because they don't count early the absentee ballots or mail ballots. They still don't have so many, and many of the counties are going to count quickly. So I might put that in kind of a middle category. If something really were to happen and it took a long time, the states I would watch would be Arizona and Nevada. They do so much voting by mail. Nevada is a state that has moved to doing mailing a ballot to everyone. It's relatively new. Arizona has several things that hold them there. So again, I think, we might know easily, late night on election night. But if it is somewhat close and we're thinking about how late things are coming in, I think that's the order we might watch the states. So with that, shall we turn to our audience? Yes. Okay. We're going to look for
your sandwiches
people
and
in
how
person.
grateful you are.
I'm going to look far in the back here, and if you identify yourself and ask a question, as they say.
Thank you. Leon Peace. And I'm a substitute teacher in Montgomery County area. My question is there a silent majority of voters out there in favor of Dobbs? And what do you think the likelihood of that might be? In other words, in favor of the Supreme Court's position.
Oh, okay. The underappreciated pro-life voter.
I do not happen to think so. In our last NBC poll, we asked a series of items about a candidate running for office. Would this make you more likely or less likely to vote for that person? And there were a lot of more likely, a lot of economic policies that both candidates are putting forward. People really did embrace, and so that would make them more likely to vote for them, including oil production here, including child tax credit as well. But there were two that the majority said would make them less likely, and one of them was the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe versus Wade, and the other was a candidate who thought that Donald Trump won the 2020 election. And so I think what you're seeing here is, it is a real rejection of that decision. And again, not just me saying it, not just our polling data, but if you look at the referenda that have taken place across the country, I think it's a sort of a perfect score. And a lot of places that are pretty red to really rebuild and take back reproductive freedom and abortion rights.
But if they're silent, you're not going to be talking to them in their polls. So that's the trick. You can't disprove that. No.
Well, point taken. But no, I don't have to think so.
Do you want to go to our audience?
Well, Nate Moore, do we have any dematerialized human beings with questions?
Liz, watching online, asks, for each of the panelists, if you could know the results of one county right now to predict who the presidential winner will be, what county would you pick and why?
Ooh, okay. What do you got? KSA, we'll start with you.
I'm going to pick this one because I've written about it a lot. Osceola County, Florida.
Nice.
Which is not in a battleground state. The reason I say Osceola County is that over the last 20 or so years, Orange County and Osceola County, which is Orlando and then South Orlando, the counties that are around Disney, essentially, they used to vote really similarly. They're part of the I-4 corridor of Florida. They used to vote pretty similarly, and they were reasonably thought of as a bellwether. In 2016, I was looking at Orange County, and it was breaking slightly for Hillary Clinton. She was putting up the numbers that you would expect. Trump won Florida because he was running up numbers in the rural counties. But in 2020, part of what helped Trump and Republicans do well is that Trump has built those margins with Latino voters and with working class voters, of whom there are lots in Osceola County. Osceola and Orange have begun to diverge, as Orange is more of the kind of white collar type county the Democrats are doing better with. Osceola is more of the new Trump coalition. It is also one of the most heavily Puerto Rican counties in Florida. And so if for no other reason than to see how that's doing.
She's always going to
Osceola
be
County,
a Florida homer.
Yeah, I was going to say, if all of us had to pick from our native states bellwether counties, I think Chris and I would be a little challenged with West Virginia, Massachusetts, but in Virginia. But we won't make you go through that. Go ahead, Jeff.
So I think I said Clallam County already, so
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I'm on the record. No, I would say Ingham County in Michigan
Yeah.
and Dane County in Wisconsin, because we talked about how important young voters are in this election, and so both the turnout and the margins in both those, Michigan State and the University of Wisconsin, I think are going to be really important counties.
And
to look
I'll
at.
take Kent County, Michigan, which is Grand Rapids, and this is the question of, are those squishy Republican, Nikki Haley kind of Republicans coming home? That's Gerald Ford's hometown. West Michigan, this is a place where the Republican Senate candidate in 2020 carried the county, but Donald Trump lost it. He had won it in 2016. We talk about the Republican base a lot, but the Republican base is not Joe Rogan's audience. The Republican base is actually suburban, always Republican voters, these stalwarts. And Donald Trump struggled with them in 2020. I want to know if they're back.
I will pick Erie County, which actually might
Easy.
be a true
Yes.
bellwether, but also will give us some sense of, maybe Donald Trump is topped out in terms of white working class voters, or maybe he's not. And so that's a county that is very close to the national average, but also in an important state. So, okay, let's go again. Let's go. We'll move around the room. How about we'll go here?
Michael Wishura. I'm a West Michigan native, so good to
you go.
hear
Here we go.
that shout out.
The wooden shoe crowd.
Muskegon guy. If we come back a month from now, particularly Kristen and Jeff, to what extent do you expect that you would agree about why what happened happened? So if I asked you what happened in 2020, is that a long argument between the two of you, or is it a short discussion because you more or less have a consensus?
I find that I agree more with my polling colleagues who are Democrats than my fellow Republicans who work in other sectors. I'll put it that way. Pollsters, we deal in data. And so oftentimes when you put two pollsters on a panel, and even though they were of different parties, we are often seeing pretty similar things. There may be slight differences. For instance, in the midterms, my Democratic colleagues were a little more convinced than I was that abortion was going to play a huge role in driving turnout. So we learn from each other for sure, but the data can be interpreted in different ways, but I find that pollsters of good faith often come to pretty similar conclusions about what reality looks like.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, we're grounded in the numbers. There's a margin of error there. There's only so far you can go one way or another, and it's hard, especially when there are actual votes. You can't say, "Oh, I didn't like that poll." It's a little bit of a different story. So no, we'd love to come back in a month, and I think. But I think we would largely be in agreement.
And we've talked here a lot about why the polls were wrong in 2020, but do we agree on why Joe Biden won in 2020? Why did Joe Biden win in 2020? That's a great question.
Because Donald Trump was a very unpopular president, and Americans wanted change, and they wanted stability, and they wanted to not feel like politics was stressing them out, and they thought that Joe Biden could deliver on that. And the fact that he couldn't is why we're having the conversation we're having now.
Do you agree?
Yeah, I think the 2020 election was a referendum on Trump, for sure.
See, look at that. They
See,
agree
we
about
need
that,
to
and they'll
get
agree
them to
about this.
disagree. Come on,
Yeah,
poke
no,
them a little bit.
This is about being cool. Yes. You want another question in
Yeah,
the room?
you go.
How about in the back, young lady in the back.
Hello. So I'm from Brazil, and in Brazil we live a scenario in the student area mostly, and we understand that this election will be decided until 5th of November until it ends. It will end, only it ends. So I'm very nervous, sorry.
You're doing great.
Thank you. So how do you guys understand the argument of people losing the expectations on the democratic institutions?
Mm-hmm.
We live this scenario in Brazil, and how do you guys see these voters in these elections in the USA? Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, part of the problem with polling is that when the results don't match the expectation, right? So if you were to ask a rank and file typical Republican, you'd say, well, Trump can't lose, right? I saw a poll that says Trump's up by 2, da-da-da-da-da. So the work that we do in forecasting and prognosticating and polling and all of that stuff ends up being used against democracy sometimes, right? People say, well, it didn't line up. These things didn't match up. Kamala Harris has put democracy, the reason she was at the Ellipse on Tuesday was to put democracy on the ballot, right? That the Republican institutions and democracy matters. But I notice in polls, both candidates, both parties feel strongly that the other party will destroy democracy. This is more of a philosophical question. But we can't have a system, can we, in which both parties claim that if the other party wins, that democracy will be destroyed, right?
Yeah, because there's a difference between the stakes being high and the stakes being apocalyptic.
Yes.
And this gets into my whole theory behind the type of polarization that we're seeing today, which is not so much a polarization where half of America believes one thing and half of America believes the other and nobody's in the middle. Any survey I do where I'm asking about policy questions, very few respondents give me all the conservative answers or all the progressive answers. Lots of people hold a mixture of views. The polarization is because people believe their side is losing or the other side is smarter, more wily, more powerful, more willing to break and bend the rules to get their way. And so because of that, people are more willing to excuse bad behavior on their side and are more willing to feel a sense of threat coming from the other side. It's less about, gosh, you believe things that are so different from me, and more, the other side is a threat to me and people like me and my way of life. And that is why the temperature is so high right now.
Do you agree with that?
I was going to say maybe, Jeff, but just to add to that, I mean, I think what Chris is saying is, obviously the closing argument for Kamala Harris is Donald Trump is not fit, not fit for democracy, a threat to democracy. That's a very powerful personal play. But the polls do show, a lot of Republicans saying, yeah, they're worried about democracy, and by that they mean things like they don't want to be censored. They think people shouldn't have cases against their presidential candidate, all those things.
And
although that's
the
probably
results.
part of the Republican message, but it's not sort of the defining closing message. So what do you say about these two things? On the one hand, different views of what democracy is, and two, this kind of closing argument for Harris.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, there is an active effort to take on our institutions and discredit them, and I think we should all be very aware of that. And I wish more people were watching the AEI live stream and were watching C-SPAN. The folks who we need to reinstill confidence in institutions are not watching C-SPAN,
Right.
and that's the problem. And so they are getting the news that they want to get to make them feel good about their worldview and not challenging their perceptions. And so, and we as a society are feeding into that, where we will give them the news they want to not question their worldview, but to reinforce it. And that's the real challenge. Again, it's not unique to our country. It's happening in Brazil and other places, but that is the real challenge. And it goes back to your obligation to tell people the truth.
And I want to reemphasize Kristen's point. If every election is the most important election in history, right, then we will forgive in our own parties and in our own selves terrible misconduct, right? We will accept the very worst things because if the other side wins, then everything is over. And I'm here to tell you that other than the election of 1800, the most important election in American history should always be the next election, right? If you don't like this one, one of the Madisonian beauties of our system is we have a lot of elections. We are crazy with the elections. We're having elections every 2 years. We're doing it all the time. We can't stop having elections. And that's good, because if you don't like the way that one turns out, you get to do it again. But we live in a time where both parties tell me that if the other side wins, it's over, right? That if the other side wins, it's all done.
And this time we mean it.
And this time we mean it. Last time it was close, but and you can't sustain a republic and its institutions in an environment where the stakes are too high. So listen to that lady.
Great. We'll go over here.
Atman Vakil, AEI. Over the next week, what areas of what states would you advise both candidates to spend the most time in?
Where do you want them to go? Where should Kamala Harris go?
Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin.
Pennsylvania, Wisconsin.
Just keep going back and forth right there, and then I mean, all seven. But I think those are the real. That should be the real focus.
And go to the sorts of places where you will encounter the cats chasing the laser pointers.
Yes. What kind of places are those?
Because, well, I think
Starbucks.
college campuses, I mean, I think the sorts of places where you might find people sympathetic to your cause, but who might just have other things to do or not really get the gravity of why voting matters, be the last thing they are thinking about when they're walking past that polling place and going, oh, yeah, I guess I should go in.
Very
So-
nice that we let
so-
those people decide our presidential elections.
Donald Trump looking to go to these tier 2 states, Albuquerque, going to Virginia. What would you say? Is it overconfidence or maybe worth it?
Donald Trump loves to project that he's a winner. This is just part of that strategy.
Okay, Nate, do we have anybody else online? No? That's it? You people are not doing anything? We're going to have to rely on people here in the room. Is this, oh, I got a guy, this side of the room. Finally, this side of the room coming through.
My name is Roger Roots. Campaign spending. You guys are all experts. I'd like maybe each of you to state what percentage of the vote do you think can actually be changed by campaign spending, either up or down?
That is a very good question.
I will just say this. Democrats have a financial advantage. You'd always want to have more. I do think broad political science research usually shows the most important thing is not that you have more, that you have a high minimum or an adequate amount. The races that people really suffer for not having enough money is they really just don't have enough. I think both campaigns are pretty well funded. So again, I'd rather be Democrats. I'd rather have a little more money. But I'm not sure that the difference between a lot of money and more than a lot of money is as great as as some would say.
It also depends on what you're spending it on. One thing that's going to be a potential, if we do this panel a month from now and we're agreeing or disagreeing on what happened, is there has been an interesting strategic choice made by the Republican Party and the Trump campaign to change how things like ground game are done. When I first showed up in Washington, which was about 20 years ago, which was not that long ago, but was also long enough.
She was 12 years old.
Yes. No.
Yes, she was taking
the
selfies.
RNC was known as this epic ground game operation that the Bush-Cheney reelect, they were exceptional at going out and turning people out. And this year, the RNC is now pivoting to focus more on what they call election integrity, basically being more focused on things like election observers and lawyers, et cetera. The ground game is being primarily done by outside groups. Now, since the super PAC era dawned, outside groups have often done ads, right? The super PAC is going to run a bunch of ads about Mitt Romney or about Hillary Clinton or whatever, and the campaign does things like ground game. This is an inversion of that, and so it'll be interesting to see, is Donald Trump just personally enough of a turnout machine that it's okay that that's been outsourced to outside groups run by folks like Elon Musk? Or is it a real problem that the Republican Party turnout apparatus has been hollowed out and handed over to others? That's something that I think will be in for a lot of scrutiny if Donald Trump loses.
How much difference does spending make?
Yeah, well, I think the question was like persuasion versus turnout, and that's sort of what we're talking about. So for people who are truly persuadable, if you look at people who are strictly independent, that's about 15, 16, somewhere percent, and those people do bounce around a lot. But this goes a lot deeper than just that. It is the turnout part too, and so that's probably another 15 or 20%. So it is super important. It's not just you can convince people to vote for you, but to actually people who share your views, to actually get them to show up and vote.
Yeah, there's two parts to that. Get them to vote for you. You have to have both of those working in tandem.
So I wholly agree with my colleague's assertion. John says there's only two kinds of money in politics: enough and not enough. Having more than enough doesn't do any good, right? The last $50 million, you can only buy so many ads. You can only spend so much. In the Montana Senate race, they're going to spend enough money to burn a wet elephant. And every resident, they will have spent enough money that every resident of Montana, that they can pay Kevin Costner to come to their house and sing them a lullaby and tell them to go vote. They're going to spend plenty of money. But if you could buy an election, Michael Bloomberg, bless him, spent $1 billion to run for president, and did he get Samoa or was it Guam? Guam or Samoa. No offense to.
He's big there.
Yeah, no offense to Guamanians or Samoans, but he didn't do very well. So, and the last thing I say about money, God bless you, what people have to do to get it is making our politics stupider. So we got the big money out of politics with the McCain-Feingold, and then we had the Citizens United decision, and now we have these super PACs where billionaires can come in and dump a bunch of money into a race and do all this other stuff. But what's the feedstock of modern political campaign contributions? Small dollar donations. How do you raise small dollar donations? By being an idiot, right? You have to palpate the anxiety and fear glands of your constituents to get them to hit that like a rat in a Skinner box, hit that bar so that they give you another $5. And part of what has corroded our discourse has been the dependence on small dollar contributions that has defined down what is acceptable discourse because of what these partisans have to do to get people to give these $5 increment dollars.
Got to go back to images. Those of you who are regular election watchers with us will have known the wet elephant, but I don't think we've heard the crooning Kevin Costner or the rat in the. Anyway, we're going to another question. Let's maybe go over to right here in this part of the room.
Hi, Nicole Uehara with Sochus Corporation. Building on your talk about all the money going in, I wondered if you had a thought about Elon Musk and his Pennsylvania gambit with $1 million a day for people who sign on to a super PAC and are registered voters.
I think the stuff that's going on with the ground game operation is going to have much more of an impact, either positively or negatively, than the Publishers Clearinghouse sweepstakes. That's getting all the news, getting all the attention from the FEC and the Justice Department, but I think it is more the extent to which that money is being spent to identify, target, turn out voters. If that's actually working the way it's supposed to, that will be a huge benefit to Donald Trump. But if it's not, I mean, the fact of the matter is that the money that Elon Musk is spending on that is much more important to me than the big checks he's handing out.
Yeah, I would just say there's a reason why he is featured prominently in a lot of the Harris ads as the close. And it reinforces the point that she is for the people and Trump is for billionaires like Musk. And so I think that speaks volumes.
Mm-hmm. One more thing on the legal question, I would say I think this thing has been crafted to be sort of right around the line of propriety. There's half of me one day says, oh, well, you know, if you pay somebody, give them a reward for having voted or having registered, that's clearly illegal. But this is kind of just around this, and so we'll know after the election, and it'll be some sort of, if it is something, campaign finance violation, not something that affects the race, but it is crafted to be kind of right around that line.
And if Donald Trump wins, Democrats will say that was why, right? In the same way that Republicans say that Mark Zuckerberg's money, the Zuckerbucks that they obsess over, made the difference, which is why they lost, because the parties, and this is something that, and I highly commend our boss Yuval Levin's new book, American Covenant, about the Constitution, how it works, and it includes the stuff in there. But if we keep having close elections, the parties don't reform. They say, oh, we missed it by that much. It was that close, so we're not going to change anything. And then they come up with devils to blame for why they lost. It was Hunter Biden's laptop being censored on Twitter that cost Donald Trump the election. No, it wasn't. It was exactly what these two people, a Republican and a Democrat, said. And if Donald Trump wins, they're going to blame Elon Musk to have fared thee well, and they'll do that rather than engage in the kind of introspection that's necessary to improve our parties.
Chris, would you like to pick our last question from the audience?
Our last questioner? Okay. What do we want over here? You want to go right to the middle? Okay, right here in the middle, yes,
Our
sir.
median voter, right here.
Right in the middle of the middle.
Thank you. Gerald Chandler here. You've already mentioned all the television ads, but my question is a follow-on that. Is that where is the best place to spend the money? On internet ads, television ads, billboards, or whatever else you can think of?
Wherever your voters are, which increasingly is online. There's still a reason why campaigns spend on broadcast television, and that's because a football game on Sunday is one of the few live television events that still gets a lot of people to watch. But you have seen an enormous amount of money shift to digital. I remember back in the 2012 cycle, I was working for a super PAC where we were going to put an ad up on digital, and reporters didn't want to cover it because it was like, well, if you put it on TV, then it's real. And that's not the case anymore. Now, it doesn't even have to be something you put money behind on digital. You put it up on an unlisted YouTube link and you give it to the right reporters, and it's sassy enough, and suddenly that's like a big thing. And so the world has changed an awful lot on that front.
And I want to be clear, I've never asked for sassy content. I'm not the reporter who wants sassy content.
Yeah, it is meeting your voters where they are, and Kristen's right, there's been a huge shift, and it's not just ads, it's also influencers is a huge part of what's going on right now. And I know we weren't going to talk about Caribbean islands, but I think this is an important part to talk about a Caribbean island because the comments on Puerto Rico do make a difference, especially at the very end of an election. And Bad Bunny, who many people never heard of Bad Bunny before the last week, he has 45 million followers on Instagram.
Yeah, he's like the most
and
famous person in the world
when he makes an endorsement to a lot of voters across the country, particularly young voters, Latino voters, and Puerto Rican voters, it makes a difference. And I do a lot of work in Puerto Rico, as John mentioned. He was instrumental in forcing the governor out of office in Puerto Rico. So I don't want to minimize that. It's not just the ads, it's also the social media for those 10% with the lasers and the cats who we joke aren't paying attention to a lot of stuff. They are online, and that's where they're being met right now, and it's super important.
But we have to know about the importance of good bunny out there, good bunny might be. So to close us out, we do want to remind you, of course, Election Watch is a series, and we are close to the election, but we always have a post-election session. Now, we have typically had it on the Thursday after the election. This time, we are moving it up. We are moving it up to November 6th at 5 p.m. So we hope you will join us for our final episode of Election Watch, but we'd also like to thank Kristen Soltis Anderson and Jeff Horwath for joining us today.
Yay!
Thank you. All right, good. That was fun. Thank you.